So as we were talking about in the previous video, tracking can have lifelong impact affecting people's opportunities for jobs and income. As we mentioned, men are often privileged in the education system, again, as a result of it being an institution or a social structure that was built by men. It's not surprising that still today we see some of the after effects of educational structure in the United States privileging men and marginalizing women. And one of the areas where we see the starkest contrast in education between men and women today is in STEM. So many studies have found that boys are often tracked into higher level math classes and science classes than women are. As a result, fewer women pursue careers in STEM today. We also know that white middle class students are more likely to be tracked up, while poor students and students of color are more likely to be tracked down. And again, these are findings coming from sociological peer-reviewed studies. If you'd like me to direct you to some of these studies, I'd be happy to do that as well. In terms of discipline and punishment in the education system, we see that students of color, especially Black and Latino boys, are more likely to be punished for minor classroom infractions. One study actually found that Black students are suspended at rates 3 times higher than their white classmates. And this is for the same infractions, right? There's a really great study that actually sat in on classrooms and kept track of how many times students of color, specifically Black and Latino boys, were likely to be get detention, suspended, or expelled in comparison to their white classmates for doing the exact same disruptive behaviors in the class. And as this one study suggests, Black students were suspended at rates 3 times higher than their white classmates, even if their white classmates were doing the same disruptive behaviors, whether it was talking back to the teacher or, being disruptive in the classroom, whatever it was. Students of color, specifically boys, were more likely to be punished for that. Now, being suspended or expelled becomes very important in terms of affecting the extended life outcomes for individuals, as we talked about in one of the previous presentations, because when you get expelled or get suspended, you're no longer allowed to be on school property. So that means that you have these children that should be in school being supervised there that are now forced to stay at home, where presumably they don't have parent supervision because their parents are probably out working. So you have these unsupervised children at home who aren't getting educated, right? They're missing out on classes, so they're more likely to fail their classes, which means they're more likely to either take longer to graduate or drop out of school altogether. And without having a high school education, they're not likely to get jobs, which increases the level of criminal activity that individuals who are expelled or suspended from high school end up participating in. Furthermore, for minority students, schools are more likely to escalate disciplinary issues to the juvenile justice system rather than handling them internally, which puts students in contact with the criminal justice system at an early age. Again, students of color are more likely to have police called on them when they are disruptive in the classroom in comparison to white students. And this is, again, what studies suggest. Research has found that even for the same behavior, a white student could talk back to a teacher or get into a fight with another student, and a teacher or an administrator at that school will be less likely to call the authorities, to call the police, than if it was the same behavior being enacted by a student of color. Students of color are far more likely to have the police called upon them. Now, what this does is it contributes to this sociological phenomenon that's referred to as the school to prison pipeline. So this is the informal tracking for students that criminalizes the deviant behaviors in schools, even minor disciplinary issues like talking back to teachers. Now this becomes exceptionally problematic because if you start building a criminal record for a child before they even become adult, obviously we're setting them up for failure, right? If you're calling the cops on a student for getting in a fight in school, especially if it's a student of color, you're building up this criminal record that's going to follow this student throughout the majority of their life. And you're also setting this really firm message within students' heads that, hey, you're not valued here, you're disruptive here, essentially we don't want you here. So imagine the psychological warfare that plays on the collective body of predominantly Black and Latino boys in the education system today. Standardized tests are another kind of interesting and problematic arena in education from a sociological perspective. Research shows that standardized tests favor white middle-class students whose socioeconomic status and other aspects of their background, specifically the cultural capital that they are more likely to receive, have afforded them various experiences that help them answer questions on tests. I just cited one of the studies here that found this, but for example, a lot of the questions that used to be on the SAT particular ask students to do some sort of like word association, right? A common example of this is a symphony is to a composer as a book is to a or an. So the answer to this question would be author, but you wouldn't know that if you grew up in a household that didn't know what a symphony was, right? Going to a symphony, going to see an orchestra perform, going to the ballet, those are social, cultural events that are typically only accessible by upper class people in society. So if you grew up in a household where you weren't going to no symphonies, you're not going to the ballet, you're not going to the orchestra, how are you expected to be able to answer this question if you don't have the experience of living that, right? Well, you might say, well, maybe they were exposed to it in their school, but that's a pretty hefty assumption to make. And what research has found is that students of color and students of lower socioeconomic status were less likely to perform well on the SATs and other standardized tests because they did not have the same cultural capital that white upper class students did. And the majority of people that are writing the SATs and writing and creating these standardized tests are, as you may guess, upper class white individuals. So they're writing these test questions from their own lived experiences, and subsequently, whether or not they even they're intended to do so, they're disadvantaging students of lower socioeconomic status and disadvantaging students of color because these tests are biased towards privileging white upper class experiences. Another problem with standardized tests is resulting from the No Child Left Behind Act. And this was a particular piece of legislation that enforced that a school's average standardized test score can be used to determine the amount of federal funding that a school receives. So essentially how this worked is that in order to maintain federal funding, schools needed a certain percentage of their students to pass the test, right? The standardized test that was administered to all students around the US, okay? However, the caveat here was that the test score only averaged students that did not have intellectual disabilities. So if you had a student that was labeled as having an intellectual disability, their test score was not calculated in your school's average, okay? So some schools got wise to this and thought, well, if we just identify our students that are struggling for any reason, whether or not they had an intellectual disability, as long as we identified those poor performing students and labeled them as intellectually disabled, their test scores wouldn't have a negative impact on the amount of federal funding we could receive. So what we ended up seeing was this sharp spike in the number of students that were being labeled intellectually disabled throughout the United States. And it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't that we had more students that actually had learning disabilities. It was simply that school administrators were getting greedy, and they knew an easy solution to ensure that they would receive as much federal funding as possible would be to drop the low-performing students from their average test scores. Now, as you might be predicting, who do you think the majority of these intellectually disabled students were? Who do you think was more likely to be labeled as an intellectually disabled student? Who do you think was less likely to perform well in school? Well, predominantly, it was students of color. It was students from lower socioeconomic status. So this system of labeling students as learning disabled resulted into another form of tracking, right? If you got labeled as learning disabled from a young age, how do you think that affected your own confidence or ability to perform in yourself, right? Even if you weren't learning disabled, maybe you were performing poorly in school because, like we talked about earlier, you came from a working class family and your family required you to work part-time or full-time after school and on weekends, so you had less time to study, less time to do your homework, doesn't necessarily mean that you're less intelligent. It just means that you had to sacrifice. You couldn't put as much effort into school because you had to put an equal or greater amount of effort into working to support your family. But as a result, you might have gotten labeled as learning disabled. And if you're labeled as learning disabled, your teachers, your counselors at school aren't going to encourage you to take more rigorous courses. They're not going to encourage you to apply to college. They're not going to encourage you to explore scholarship opportunities that could even enable you to extend your education beyond high school. So this is a really slippery slope that many schools fell into as a result of this standardized testing measure enforced by the No Child Left Behind Act. Let's also talk a little bit about education and symbolic interactionism. So in juxtaposition to conflict theory, which is really focusing on how unequal distributions of power affect the way students are treated, symbolic interactionism is really focused on how we label students, right? So going back to tracking, we can definitely apply symbolic interactionism to that mechanism as well. How does labeling a student as a honor student versus labeling them as an intellectually disabled student affect the way that individuals and other people view and treat those students in the education system? So symbolic interactionists focus on the causes and effect of micro-level interactions between people and students, and they examine how the meanings and labels attached to students through everyday interactions end up having real material, tangible consequences in their everyday lives. So one example of this, a student who doesn't turn in their homework assignment may get labeled as being lazy by their teachers or by their classmates, while students who do particularly well on their homework assignments or on exams might get labeled as smart, right? And this labeling that gets attached to us ends up having real meaningful consequences on our lived experiences. So tracking students often results into what sociologists refer to as self-fulfilling prophecies. So these are oftentimes false ideas that eventually come true simply because they were predicted. So this is the power of sociology here. This is pretty powerful stuff. If we teach someone to believe something or lead them to believe something, even if it isn't true, it can actually end up becoming a reality. That's this idea behind self-fulfilling prophecies, and we see this very clearly in education. Studies find that teachers who favor certain students and label them as being good students or smart students pay less attention to students that they label as being bad or unintelligent. And the more attention that students get and more attention students receive, the more positive affirmation students receive, the better they end up performing in classroom. And the exact opposite is true. Students who get labeled as bad students, students who get labeled as intellectually disabled, perform less well, they put in less effort into performing in their schooling, and they receive worse grades as a result. Right? So there's a really well-known study called the Pygmalion effect. I include a link to a video in the slides this week if you'd like to watch that. But it really is just this reaffirmation of the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you label a student as a good student and treat them well, give them gold stars, encourage them to do well, they're more likely to perform well. And then subsequently, if you treat a student as a bad egg, they're less likely to perform in school, right? So students who get labeled as gifted are more likely to succeed academically. Students who are labeled as learning disabled or intellectually disabled are less likely to succeed academically. And as we said before, this has racial consequences and socioeconomic consequences because teachers are more likely to positively label white upper class students, and they're more likely to negatively label poor students of color. All right, so competitive grading is another social problem that sociologists are interested in. Essentially, this is just kind of getting at the idea or the realization of how we label intelligent students versus non-intelligent students, and whether or not those labels are actually accurate representations of intelligence in the first place. So for example, does a student with a 4.0 GPA really represent an intelligent being, or is that just a label that can be attached to that? What's the meaning we ascribe to these different measurements of education in the United States? And it's a really interesting question to think about because I'm sure many of you know people that have really high GPAs, maybe people that perform particularly well on the SAT or the ACT, but in reality, maybe you don't think they're that intelligent of a person. So this approach of kind of assigning worth or intelligence to individual based off of some label or symbol does not really encourage learning. It doesn't inspire people to work harder. It really just encourages students to do the bare minimum to win and achieve whatever measurement goal they're reaching towards over others in order to be successful.